The doctors said I'd never walk again after the accident, but they were wrong about one thing. They said my family would be my greatest source of strength. 4 years later, watching my father load my custom wheelchair into a stranger's pickup truck for $300 while my mother stood behind him nodding in approval, I realized just how catastrophically wrong they'd been. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Alex Chen, and this story begins on what should have been one of the proudest days of my life. At 22, I had just received my acceptance letter to Portland State University's graduate program in social work. After 4 years of rebuilding my life following a devastating car accident that left me paralyzed from the waist down, I was finally ready to turn my experience into something meaningful. I wanted to help other people navigate the system that had been both my salvation and my nightmare. The accident happened during my senior year at Oregon State. Marcus Rivera and I were driving back from spring break when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into the passenger side of our car. Marcus walked away with a broken arm and some cuts. I didn't walk away at all. The impact compressed my L2 and L3 vertebrae, severing my spinal cord and changing everything about the future I had planned. Those first months in the hospital were a blur of surgeries, physical therapy, and learning how to navigate a world suddenly designed for people who could do something I couldn't. My parents, Bob and Linda Chen, visited every day initially. They brought flowers, magazines, and promises that everything would be okay. Dad would pat my shoulder and tell me the Chen family was strong, that we'd get through this together. Mom would fuss over my blankets and complain to the nurses about the food quality. My younger sister Jessica was finishing her sophomore year at University of Portland, studying business with dreams of opening her own marketing firm. She visited less frequently, claiming her studies kept her busy, but when she did come, she seemed uncomfortable. She'd sit in the chair furthest from my bed and scroll through her phone, making polite conversation about classes and friends I no longer knew. The rehabilitation process was grueling. Learning to transfer from bed to wheelchair, navigating curbs and doorways, rebuilding upper body strength I never knew I needed. Dr. Sarah Martinez, my physical therapist, became more than a healthcare provider. She was a mentor who pushed me beyond what I thought was possible. When I wanted to quit, convinced I'd never have a normal life, she'd remind me that normal was relative. She'd seen hundreds of patients rebuild their lives differently but meaningfully. Marcus never wavered. While other friends gradually stopped visiting, citing the distance from Corvallis or the awkwardness of not knowing what to say, Marcus made the drive every weekend. He'd bring homework, video games, or sometimes just sit with me through the bad days when phantom pain made me want to scream. When I was discharged after 6 months, he helped my family retrofit our house with ramps and grab bars. The modifications were expensive. Insurance covered some of it, but accessibility improvements quickly drained my parents' savings. They never complained directly to me, but I heard the late-night arguments through my new ground-floor bedroom walls. Dad's construction business had been struggling since the recession, and Mom's part-time job at the dental office barely covered groceries. Adding medical bills and home modifications created pressure I could feel every time they looked at me. Jessica transferred to Portland State, claiming she wanted to be closer to family, but I suspected the truth was financial. University of Portland's tuition was twice as much, and with my ongoing medical expenses, something had to give. She moved back home, taking my old bedroom upstairs while I occupied what used to be Dad's workshop. The dynamic felt wrong. I was 21 years old, living in a converted garage space, dependent on my family for transportation, meals, and basic assistance. The custom wheelchair changed everything. After 2 years of using a basic hospital model that left my shoulders aching and limited my mobility, Dr. Martinez helped me apply for a grant through a local nonprofit. The Quantum Edge was a revelation: lightweight titanium frame, ergonomic seating, quick-release wheels for car transfers, and, most importantly, the independence to navigate Portland's hilly terrain without constant assistance. For the first time since the accident, I felt like myself again. I could get to the coffee shop 3 blocks away without help. I could navigate the Portland State campus independently. I started volunteering at the Disability Resource Center, helping other students adapt to campus life. The chair wasn't just mobility equipment, it was freedom, dignity, and the foundation of my rebuilding identity. Marcus and I found an accessible apartment in Southeast Portland, splitting rent and creating the independent living situation I desperately needed. I was accepted into graduate school, qualified for vocational rehabilitation funding, and for the first time in years felt hopeful about the future. My parents seemed proud, or at least relieved. Family dinners became less tense. Jessica even started asking about my classes and advocacy work. That's what made the betrayal so shocking. I had trusted them with my life, literally and figuratively. They had seen me at my absolute lowest, helped me climb back towards something resembling normalcy, and watched me finally start thriving. The custom wheelchair wasn't just equipment they sold. It was the symbol of everything I had fought to rebuild, the tool that made my independence possible, and the foundation of the future I was finally brave enough to imagine. Standing in our driveway that morning, watching my mobility disappear into a stranger's truck for less than the cost of Jessica's textbooks, I realized my family had never seen my disability as something to overcome. They had seen it as something to endure, a burden they had carried long enough, a problem they were finally ready to solve by making it disappear. The conversation that changed everything started innocuously enough. I had wheeled myself over to the family house that Tuesday morning to pick up some mail that still came there and grab lunch with Mom like we did every couple weeks. The routine felt normal, comfortable even. Jessica was home between classes, sprawled across the living room couch with her laptop, working on what looked like a marketing presentation. Dad was in his workshop, the familiar sound of his table saw cutting through pine boards for Mrs. Henderson's kitchen renovation project. Mom was making her famous chicken salad sandwiches when Jessica looked up from her screen and made the comment that started the avalanche. She was scrolling through apartment listings, complaining about Portland's rental market and how impossible it was to find something decent that wouldn't drain her savings account. The studios near campus were overpriced shoebox units, and anything larger required roommates she didn't particularly want to live with. That's when she mentioned the house. A gorgeous Victorian rental had just listed in the Hawthorne district, walking distance from Portland State, with original hardwood floors and a clawfoot bathtub she'd dreamed about since freshman year. The rent was steep but manageable if she could secure the deposit, which was substantial. She pulled up photos on her laptop, turning the screen toward Mom and me with the enthusiasm of someone who had already mentally moved in. The place was undeniably beautiful. High ceilings, bay windows, vintage charm that screamed Portland hipster paradise. Jessica had already calculated how her marketing internship income plus her part-time job at the campus bookstore would cover monthly expenses. But the deposit was the obstacle. 3 months rent up front plus security deposit meant she needed nearly $4,000 immediately. Mom's response should have been my first warning sign. Instead of the gentle discouragement I expected, given Dad's business struggles and their ongoing financial stress from my medical expenses, she nodded thoughtfully and said maybe there was a way to help. She exchanged a look with Dad, who had wandered in from the workshop wiping sawdust from his hands, that I didn't fully understand at the time. Over the next few days, I noticed subtle changes in how they acted around me. Conversations stopped when I entered rooms. Mom started asking weird questions about my daily routines, like how often I actually used my chair versus staying home, or whether Marcus ever borrowed it for anything. Dad mentioned several times how expensive medical equipment held its value, almost like he was testing my reaction to the concept. The shift became more pronounced when Jessica brought up her housing situation again during Sunday family dinner. She had scheduled a viewing for the Victorian place and was more excited than I had seen her about anything in months. The landlord was motivated to fill it quickly and had hinted that a prompt deposit could secure the lease before other applicants had a chance to compete. That's when Mom made the suggestion that still makes my stomach clench when I think about it. She said maybe it was time for me to consider whether I really needed such an expensive piece of equipment. She used that phrase, expensive piece of equipment, like she was discussing a rarely used exercise bike collecting dust in the basement. The custom chair had cost nearly $8,000, she reminded me, and weren't there perfectly adequate alternatives that cost much less? Dad joined the conversation with his practical tone, the one he used when discussing business investments or major purchases. He pointed out that I had been managing just fine with the basic hospital chair for 2 years before getting the quantum edge. Maybe I had gotten too dependent on luxury features that weren't actually necessary for basic mobility. Jessica nodded along, adding that she had seen plenty of disabled students on campus using simple, functional wheelchairs that seemed to work perfectly well for their needs. The conversation felt surreal. They were discussing my primary means of navigating the world like it was an optional upgrade I had been spoiled with for too long. When I tried to explain the difference the custom chair made in my daily independence, how the proper fit prevented pressure sores and shoulder injuries, how the lightweight design meant I could actually lift it in and out of cars myself, they listened with the patronizing patience people use with children explaining why they need the expensive toy instead of the generic version. Mom's argument became more pointed. She reminded me that they had sacrificed tremendously to support me through the worst period of my life. Dad's business had suffered because he spent so much time at the hospital and driving me to appointments. They had depleted their retirement savings for home modifications, and medical expenses insurance wouldn't cover. Jessica had given up her dream school to transfer somewhere more affordable, partly because my needs had strained the family budget. Now Jessica had an opportunity to finally pursue something she wanted, something that could set her up for future success, but they couldn't help her because so much money was tied up in my medical equipment. Wasn't there some way I could contribute to the family solution? The custom chair was sitting in our apartment most days anyway while I worked from home or attended online classes. When I did go out, wouldn't a basic chair serve the same transportation function? The conversations stretched over several days, becoming more insistent each time the subject arose. They painted it as a temporary sacrifice, suggesting I could always save up for another custom chair later when my career was established. Right now, the family needed to support Jessica's opportunity the same way they had supported my recovery. It was about fairness, they said, about everyone contributing to the family's overall success. Jessica's enthusiasm for the apartment became increasingly desperate as other applicants scheduled viewings. She started mentioning backup options that were clearly inferior, settling for places she didn't want because the perfect opportunity was slipping away. The emotional pressure mounted daily until finally, on that gray Thursday morning, Dad made the announcement that they had found a buyer willing to pay cash immediately. He presented it as a done deal, a family decision that had been made for the greater good. The buyer was a medical equipment dealer who specialized in reselling high-end mobility devices to people whose insurance wouldn't cover new purchases. Dad had researched the market value and negotiated what he claimed was a fair price, though it was less than half what the chair cost new. The transaction was happening that morning, he informed me, because the dealer was only in Portland for the day and Jessica needed to submit her deposit by noon to secure the Victorian rental. Everything had been arranged efficiently, practically, with the same methodical approach Dad brought to his construction projects. The only detail he hadn't considered was asking whether I agreed to give up the foundation of my independence so my sister could have hardwood floors and a clawfoot bathtub. I stood in my parents' driveway at 8:30 that morning, watching my father shake hands with a complete stranger over the sale of my independence. The medical equipment dealer was exactly what you'd expect from someone who made money off other people's desperation. Thin, nervous energy, constantly checking his phone, treating my custom Quantum Edge wheelchair like a commodity, rather than the piece of equipment that gave me freedom to exist in the world. The betrayal hit me in waves. First was disbelief, the kind of mental static that happens when reality doesn't match what your brain can process. I kept expecting Dad to tell the buyer there had been a mistake, that the chair wasn't actually for sale. Instead, he was helping the man examine the frame for scratches and testing the quick-release mechanisms, like a used car salesman highlighting features to justify the price. Mom stood beside Jessica on the front porch, both of them watching the transaction with expressions I couldn't read. Jessica clutched her phone, presumably ready to call the Victorian house landlord the moment the cash changed hands. She avoided making eye contact with me, focusing instead on her phone screen or studying the pattern of clouds gathering overhead. The Portland sky was doing its typical spring morning routine, promising rain before noon. The dealer counted out $300 in 20s, while Dad nodded approvingly at the amount. $300 for equipment that had cost nearly $8,000. $300 that represented months of grant applications, insurance appeals, and occupational therapy evaluations to prove I needed something beyond basic hospital equipment. The man folded the bills and handed them to my father like he was buying a used lawnmower at a garage sale. When I found my voice, it came out strangled and higher than normal. I asked Dad what he thought he was doing, selling my wheelchair without even discussing it with me first. The question seemed to surprise him, as if my ownership of the equipment that kept me mobile was somehow unclear. He explained again, with the patience of someone talking to a confused child, that the family had made a collective decision to help Jessica with her housing deposit. The word collective hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't been part of any collective decision-making process. Nobody had asked my opinion about trading my mobility for Jessica's apartment upgrade. The family had apparently held meetings and made plans that affected my life more than anyone else's, and I had been excluded entirely from the conversation. I turned to Mom, hoping for some sign that she understood how insane this situation was, but her expression remained neutral. She had perfected that look during my hospital stay, the face she wore when discussing difficult medical decisions or insurance denials. Clinical. Practical. Emotionally detached from the human impact of whatever solution had been deemed most efficient. Jessica finally spoke, her voice defensive but trying to sound reasonable. She reminded me that I had been managing fine with regular chairs for most of my life, and suggested that maybe I had become too dependent on expensive equipment. She pointed out that plenty of people with disabilities lived full lives without custom mobility devices, and implied that my attachment to the Quantum Edge was more about vanity than necessity. Her words stung because they revealed how little my own family understood about my daily reality. The difference between basic hospital equipment and my custom chair wasn't about luxury or vanity. It was about preventing pressure sores that could lead to life-threatening infections. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. It was about shoulder preservation, since my arms were now my primary means of propulsion and transferring my body weight. It was about the difference between surviving and actually living. The dealer grew impatient with our family discussion and mentioned that he had other appointments across the city before his flight back to Seattle that evening. Dad apologized for the delay and began wheeling my chair toward the man's pickup truck. I watched my independence being loaded into a stranger's vehicle while my family stood around like this was a normal Tuesday morning transaction. I tried one more time to appeal to reason, explaining to Mom and Dad how the custom chair enabled my graduate school attendance, my volunteer work, my ability to contribute meaningfully to my community. Without it, I would be back to the limitations I had during my first 2 years post-accident, dependent on others for transportation, unable to navigate Portland's challenging terrain, restricted to accessible buildings only. Mom's response revealed the depth of their misunderstanding about my life and needs. She suggested that maybe being more dependent wouldn't be such a bad thing, that I had been pushing myself too hard trying to maintain independence when family was supposed to help each other. She mentioned that they worried about me living alone with Marcus, navigating the city without supervision, taking on too much responsibility too quickly after such a life-changing injury. The paternalistic tone was devastating. 4 years after my accident, my parents still saw me as a patient rather than an adult rebuilding his life. They viewed my independence as reckless rather than healthy, my accomplishments as risks rather than achievements. In their minds, selling my mobility equipment was protective rather than destructive, keeping me safe by keeping me limited. Dad finished securing my wheelchair in the dealer's truck bed with bungee cords, while I sat in our old backup chair, a basic hospital model I hadn't used regularly in over a year. The difference was immediately apparent. The seat was too wide, offering no lateral support. The footrests were positioned wrong for my leg length. The wheels were smaller and harder to grip, making propulsion inefficient and painful after more than a few minutes. Jessica's phone rang, and she answered with barely contained excitement. The landlord was confirming her appointment to sign the lease and provide the deposit. She thanked him enthusiastically, giving Dad a thumbs up to indicate the timing was working perfectly. Her dream apartment was secured by the sale of my ability to navigate the world independently. The dealer drove away with my chair while Jessica headed inside to get ready for her lease signing. Mom and Dad lingered in the driveway, perhaps expecting gratitude for their sacrifice on Jessica's behalf, or maybe waiting for me to acknowledge that their decision was best for the family overall. Instead, I wheeled myself toward my car, struggling with the unfamiliar backup chair and the reality that my own parents had just sold my freedom for $300. The physical discomfort was immediate, but the emotional devastation ran much deeper. My family had demonstrated that my independence was negotiable, my needs were secondary, and my voice didn't matter when they decided what was best for everyone. They had reduced 4 years of rebuilding my life to a simple math problem where Jessica's wants outweighed my basic mobility requirements. The immediate consequences of losing my chair hit me before I even made it home that morning. The backup hospital wheelchair fought me at every turn, its poorly adjusted footrests catching on the car door frame as I struggled to transfer into my Honda Civic. What should have been a smooth, practiced movement became an awkward, painful ordeal that left my shoulders burning and my dignity in tatters. Marcus was waiting for me when I finally wheeled through our apartment door 20 minutes later than usual, his concerned expression shifting to alarm when he saw the ancient hospital equipment I was using. He knew my routine, knew the sound of my quantum edge wheels on our hardwood floors, knew something was catastrophically wrong when I appeared struggling with a chair I hadn't touched in over a year. I couldn't find words initially. How do you explain that your family sold your independence while you ate cereal that morning? How do you describe watching your father load your freedom into a stranger's truck for less money than Jessica spent on textbooks last semester? Marcus listened in stunned silence as I recounted the morning's events, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked like grief. The physical discomfort intensified throughout that first day. The backup chair's seat was configured for someone with different proportions, creating pressure points that would lead to skin breakdown if I didn't address them quickly. The wheel positioning forced my shoulders into unnatural angles, creating strain patterns that would cause injury if sustained. By evening, I was experiencing the kind of pain I hadn't felt since my earliest days of learning to use a wheelchair. Marcus helped me research immediate solutions, but the reality was stark. Custom wheelchairs required weeks of evaluation, measurement, and fitting. Insurance approval processes moved at glacial speeds, assuming they approved anything at all. The Disability Resource Center at Portland State had loaner equipment, but nothing approaching the specifications my body required for daily use without injury. I called Dr. Martinez the next morning, hoping she might have emergency equipment or expedited options through the rehabilitation hospital. Her reaction to my family's decision was immediate and fierce. She used words like medical negligence and endangerment, explaining that removing properly fitted mobility equipment from someone with my injury level was equivalent to taking prescription medication away from a diabetic. She scheduled an emergency appointment to assess the damage the backup chair was already causing to my posture and skin integrity. The examination confirmed my fears. Pressure marks were developing on my tailbone and hip joints. My shoulders showed signs of impingement from the incorrect wheel positioning. If I continued using inadequate equipment for more than a few days, I risked serious complications that could require hospitalization. Dr. Martinez documented everything meticulously, photographing the pressure marks and noting the measurable difference in my positioning between proper and improper equipment. She explained that she was filing reports with Adult Protective Services and the State Disability Rights Office, since what my family had done constituted abuse of a vulnerable adult. The legal terminology felt surreal, but she was adamant that medical equipment theft was a criminal offense. The practical implications cascaded rapidly. I couldn't attend my graduate classes because navigating the Portland State campus in the backup chair was physically impossible. The hills and distances that were manageable in my custom equipment became insurmountable obstacles. I missed my volunteer shifts at the Disability Resource Center, unable to maintain the stamina and mobility my responsibilities required. Simple errands became monumental challenges. The grocery store where I shopped weekly had aisles too narrow for the backup chair's turning radius. The coffee shop where I studied had a step I could navigate in my quantum edge, but couldn't manage with hospital equipment. Even our apartment's bathroom became problematic, the door clearance tight enough that the wider backup chair barely fit through. Marcus watched me struggle with increasing frustration and helplessness. He offered to drive me everywhere, to carry groceries, to help with transfers I had been managing independently for years. His kindness was genuine, but it highlighted how dramatically my autonomy had been stripped away overnight. I was back to depending on others for basic activities I had fought to master on my own. Sleep became elusive, as the backup chair forced my body into positions that aggravated my injury. I woke up multiple times each night with muscle spasms and nerve pain, side effects of using equipment that didn't support my specific needs. The exhaustion compounded everything else, making simple decisions feel overwhelming and emotional regulation nearly impossible. Jessica's social media posts from her new apartment felt like salt in the wound. She shared photos of the Victorian's beautiful features, the hardwood floors she had coveted, the clawfoot bathtub she described as a dream come true. She tagged our parents, thanking them for making her happiness possible. The gratitude felt obscene when I knew exactly what price had been paid for her hardwood floors. I tried calling Dad twice that week, hoping he might recognize the mistake and help me recover my chair from the dealer. Both times, he deflected my concerns and suggested I was being dramatic about the equipment difference. He reminded me that thousands of people used basic wheelchairs without complaints, and implied that my attachment to expensive equipment was preventing me from accepting my limitations gracefully. Mom's response was even more devastating. When I explained the medical complications developing from improper equipment, she suggested that maybe this was an opportunity to reevaluate whether I was pushing myself too hard. She thought perhaps returning to a more dependent lifestyle would be healthier, safer, more realistic for someone with my level of injury. The conversation revealed how fundamentally they misunderstood my recovery journey. They saw independence as dangerous rather than healthy, self-reliance as stubbornness rather than strength. In their minds, my struggle to maintain autonomy was evidence that I needed more supervision, not better equipment. By the end of that first week, I was facing skin breakdown, shoulder injury, academic suspension, and the loss of volunteer positions I had worked years to secure. The backup chair had transformed me from a graduate student and disability advocate into someone struggling to complete basic daily activities without assistance. My family's decision to prioritize Jessica's housing preferences over my medical needs had effectively reversed 4 years of rehabilitation progress in 7 days. The isolation was perhaps the cruelest consequence. Friends from school couldn't understand why I had suddenly become unavailable. Professors questioned my commitment when I missed classes without explanation. The disability community I had become part of watched me disappear from events and advocacy work, unaware that my absence was involuntary rather than chosen. The unexpected kindness came from the most unlikely source on a drizzling Thursday morning when desperation had finally driven me to attempt something I knew was physically impossible. I had been trying to reach Sunrise Cafe in the Pearl District, a coffee shop 3 blocks from our apartment where I used to study regularly. The backup hospital chair made the journey torturous, its inadequate wheel size catching on every sidewalk crack, and its poor weight distribution making the gentle Portland hills feel like mountain climbs. I made it halfway before my shoulders gave out completely. The muscle spasms hit suddenly, sharp enough to make me gasp audibly. I found myself stranded on Northwest Glisson Street, unable to propel the chair another foot forward, too far from home to turn back, sweating despite the cool morning air. Cars passed by with their drivers carefully avoiding eye contact, that particular form of urban blindness people develop when confronted with someone else's struggle. Mrs. Dorothy Williams noticed me first. She was unlocking the front door of her small community center, a converted storefront that served breakfast to anyone who needed it regardless of their ability to pay. At 73, Dot had been running the Neighborhood Assistance Program for over a decade, funded through her late husband's modest life insurance and her own Social Security check. She moved with the purposeful energy of someone who had spent decades recognizing when people needed help and providing it without being asked. She approached me directly, none of the hesitation or awkward politeness that usually preceded interactions with strangers about my disability. Her first question was whether I was hurt, followed immediately by an assessment of what I needed rather than assumptions about what she thought I could handle. When I explained that my shoulders had seized up from using improper equipment, She nodded with the understanding of someone who had seen plenty of people struggling with systems that weren't designed for their needs. Dot didn't offer sympathy or inspirational platitudes about overcoming challenges. Instead, she asked practical questions about how long I had been using the hospital chair, whether I had proper cushioning to prevent pressure sores, and if I had eaten anything that morning. Her matter-of-fact approach was refreshing after a week of well-meaning friends treating my situation like a tragic movie plot rather than a solvable problem. She insisted I come inside the community center while she called her grandson Jerome, who worked as a medical equipment technician at the Veterans Hospital. Jerome arrived within 20 minutes, a lanky young man in his late 20s, who immediately understood the severity of my situation. He examined the backup chair with professional competence, pointing out specific ways the poor fit was creating injury risk and mobility limitations. Jerome had access to adaptive equipment through his work with disabled veterans, and he knew the underground network of medical supply exchanges that existed in Portland's disability community. He made several phone calls while Dot insisted I eat the scrambled eggs and toast she prepared without asking whether I wanted them. Her kitchen operated on the principle that everyone needed feeding, and arguments about hunger were irrelevant when food was available. The first breakthrough came through Jerome's contact at the Disabled American Veterans chapter, where a member had recently passed away and left behind a high-quality manual wheelchair that was collecting dust in his widow's garage. The chair wasn't custom-fitted to my specifications, but it was lightweight titanium with proper ergonomic design, infinitely better than the hospital equipment that was destroying my shoulders. Mrs. Rodriguez, the veteran's widow, insisted on bringing the chair to the community center herself, rather than making me travel to retrieve it. She arrived that afternoon with tears in her eyes, explaining that her husband Miguel would have been honored to know his equipment was helping another young person maintain independence. She refused any payment, saying that seeing the chair used by someone who needed it was worth more than money. The difference was immediate and dramatic. The veteran's wheelchair fit my body properly, supported my posture correctly, and allowed me to move efficiently without pain. For the first time in over a week, I could navigate Portland's sidewalks without exhausting myself or risking injury. Jerome spent an hour adjusting the footrests and armrests to optimize the fit for my proportions. Dot watched this transformation with satisfaction, but she wasn't finished helping. She had been listening to my story about family betrayal and financial barriers to replacing my custom equipment, and she had ideas about solutions that extended beyond emergency mobility aids. She introduced me to her network of community advocates, people who had been fighting systemic injustices in Portland for decades. Through Dot's connections, I met advocates from the Disability Rights Center who specialized in equipment theft cases. They explained that what my family had done constituted a form of abuse that could be prosecuted criminally, and that civil remedies existed to recover the value of my stolen equipment. More importantly, they connected me with legal aid attorneys who took these cases without charging fees that struggling disabled people couldn't afford. The legal advocates also introduced me to Dr. Patricia Chang, a disability rights attorney who had built her career on cases exactly like mine. Dr. Chang had grown up with a disabled brother and understood both the legal and emotional complexities of family members who viewed adaptive equipment as negotiable commodities rather than essential medical devices. Dr. Chang's initial consultation revealed that my case was stronger than I had realized. Oregon had specific statutes protecting disabled people's medical equipment from theft, even by family members. The fact that my parents had sold the chair without my consent, while I was dependent on it for basic mobility, elevated the offense to felony level. She was confident about both criminal prosecution and civil recovery of damages. Beyond legal remedies, Dot's community center became an unexpected source of daily support. She hired me to help coordinate their disability advocacy programs, work I could do from their accessible space while my legal case proceeded. The position provided income, purpose, and connection to a community that understood struggle without treating it as inspiration porn. The volunteers at Dot's center included other disabled people who had faced family betrayal, veterans who had been abandoned by relatives who couldn't handle their injuries, and elderly people whose children had stolen their resources. They shared stories, strategies, and solidarity without the patronizing tone I had endured from well-meaning friends who couldn't imagine family members acting with such cruelty. Jerome became not just my equipment technician but a genuine friend who understood the intersection of disability and technology. He taught me about grant programs for custom equipment, insurance advocacy strategies, and the network of organizations that provided emergency assistance when systems failed. His knowledge came from years of helping veterans navigate bureaucracies designed to deny rather than provide necessary support. Most importantly, this community of unexpected allies helped me understand that my family's betrayal, while deeply personal, was part of a larger pattern of society devaluing disabled people's autonomy. They reframed my experience from individual tragedy to systemic injustice, which felt empowering rather than isolating. I wasn't alone in facing family members who prioritized convenience over their disabled relatives' dignity. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.